He was about 6 feet tall, that he was completely scourged all over his body. He was crucified, and nobody dies for a lie. Who gets back up 3 days later after he gets murdered in public?
What if the most controversial film ever made almost destroyed the man who created it? What if the real story behind the camera, the suffering, the miracles, the industry blacklisting, the personal collapse, was even more dramatic than anything on the screen? You've seen The Passion of the Christ, but I promise you, you have never heard this version of events. Because until now, Mel Gibson kept it buried. Tonight, everything comes out. Let's set the scene. It's 2003. Hollywood is at the height of its power. Blockbusters are minting billionaires. And Mel Gibson, fresh off Braveheart, fresh off the Lethal Weapon franchise, one of the biggest stars on the planet, decides to walk away from all of it. Not to take a vacation, not to make a safer bet, but to fund, direct, and pour his entire soul into a film about the final 12 hours of Jesus Christ's life. A film shot entirely in Aramaic and Latin. A film with no major studio backing. A film that the industry said, no, screamed, would be the single biggest financial disaster in Hollywood history. The experts called it career suicide. The critics called it dangerous. And Mel Gibson called it the most important thing he'd ever do. But here's what nobody knew. The nightmare was only just beginning. Before a single frame was shot, Mel Gibson was already bleeding. And I don't mean that metaphorically. He had poured over $25 million of his own money into this project. His own fortune. His own savings. The kind of financial risk that would make any sane person walk away. But Gibson wasn't walking away. Why? Because he wasn't doing this for Hollywood. He wasn't doing this for awards. He went on record saying he was making this film to save his own soul. Think about that. Here is one of the most successful men in the entertainment industry, and is telling the world that he was spiritually broken, that he had hit rock bottom, that he was suicidal. He has said in multiple interviews that had he not started this film when he did, he genuinely believes he would not be alive today. That is not a promotional soundbite. That is a man on the edge, reaching for the only rope he could find. And then the attack started. Oh, the attacks were massive. Before the film even had a release date, before most people had seen a single scene, a firestorm of controversy erupted across the media. Critics who hadn't seen the film were calling it anti-Semitic. Prominent religious leaders were calling it dangerous. Hollywood insiders, many of them Gibson's former colleagues and collaborators, were publicly distancing themselves. There were organized campaigns to have the film shut down entirely. Gibson has said he was essentially blacklisted during this period. Phone calls stopped coming. Doors that had always been open were suddenly, quietly, permanently shut. The man who had once been Hollywood royalty was now being treated like a pariah. And yet he kept going. Why? Because here's what nobody in the industry understood. Mel Gibson had already been through something on that set that made Hollywood politics look completely irrelevant. Let's talk about what actually happened during production, because this is where the story takes a turn that even the most dedicated fans of this film have never fully grasped. The shoot took place in Italy, primarily in Matera and Krakow, ancient landscapes that doubled for first-century Jerusalem. And from the very first day, strange things started happening. Jim Caviezel, the actor portraying Jesus, was struck by lightning. Not metaphorically, literally struck by lightning on set. Twice. He dislocated his shoulder during a scene. He suffered hypothermia. He contracted a lung infection. He was accidentally scourged with a real whip, leaving a 14-inch scar on his back. And throughout all of this, Gibson kept his cameras rolling because he believed, truly and deeply believed, that what they were creating was something that transcended ordinary filmmaking. But the crew? The crew was rattled because the lightning strikes, the accidents, the inexplicable string of misfortunes, they started to feel like something more than coincidence. But here's what really destroyed Mel Gibson during production. It wasn't the physical challenges. It wasn't the budget pressure. It was the emotional and spiritual weight of what he was depicting. He has spoken about spending hours on his knees between takes, about crying so hard he couldn't see the monitor, about feeling a crushing sense of personal guilt, as if he himself was responsible for the suffering being recreated on screen. In one of the most revealing moments he has ever shared publicly, Gibson described standing behind the camera watching Jim Caviezel ride in agony during the crucifixion scenes and feeling something break inside him. Not shatter dramatically, just quietly, permanently break. He said that making this film cost him more than the $25 million. It cost him something he still hasn't fully recovered. And yet, and this is a part that floors me, he has also said he would do it again without hesitation. Now let's talk about the release, because this is where the stories shift from tragedy to one of the most shocking box office moments in cinematic history. February 25th, 2004. Ash Wednesday, a date Gibson chose deliberately and symbolically, and the industry watched with a mixture of cynicism and barely concealed anticipation for failure. The mainstream press had spent months predicting catastrophe, and then the numbers came in. Opening day, the film made $26.6 million. That's right, in a single day, Gibson nearly recouped his entire personal investment. By the end of opening weekend, the film had made $83 million. $83 million. From a film with no major studio support. From a film in dead languages. From a film the experts said nobody would see. It went on to gross over $600 million worldwide, making it one of the highest-grossing R-rated films in history. The same Hollywood establishment that had declared Gibson finished was now staring at numbers they couldn't explain. But here's what the box office numbers can't tell you. Here's what never gets talked about in the mainstream coverage of this film. The effect it had on people who saw it. Not critics, not industry analysts, actual human beings sitting in darkened theaters. Gibson has collected accounts, hundreds of them, of people who walked into screenings depressed, addicted, suicidal, spiritually empty, and walked out changed. There are documented accounts of people confessing to cold case crimes after seeing the film. Hardened gang members abandoning violent lives. Marriages saved. Suicides prevented. Gibson speaks about these accounts with a visible emotional overwhelm that no amount of Hollywood training could fake. He didn't just make a movie. By almost any measure you choose to apply, he changed lives. And that, he has said, is the only legacy he actually cares about. And then the personal destruction came. Because you cannot tell the story of the Passion of the Christ without confronting what came after it. The film was a phenomenon, and Mel Gibson was, briefly, at the absolute peak of his power and influence. But the industry never forgave him. The blacklisting that had begun before the film's release quietly solidified into something permanent. Major studios wouldn't touch him. Award campaigns that should have been obvious simply didn't happen. And Gibson himself began to unravel. The drinking that had plagued him for years intensified. His marriage collapsed. And then came 2006. The DUI arrest. The recorded rant that played on a loop across every media outlet on the planet. And just like that, the narrative was set in stone. Mel Gibson, visionary director, box office titan, man who had made one of the most profitable independent films ever, was now just a punchline, just a cautionary tale, just a villain in someone else's story. But ask yourself this, who wrote that story? And why were they so determined to make sure the world never separated the man from the movie? Because here's what gets lost in all of that noise. Here's the thing that doesn't fit the neat narrative. Between the release of The Passion and his very public collapse, Mel Gibson gave an extraordinary number of interviews. And in those interviews, he spoke with a depth and vulnerability that Hollywood almost never produces. He talked about depression, about addiction, about the feeling of being spiritually exposed and then having everything stripped away. He talked about how making The Passion had cracked him open, had forced him to confront every dark corner of himself, and how he hadn't known what to do with what he found there. This wasn't a man performing contrition for the cameras. This was a man genuinely, visibly, struggling to integrate an experience that had fundamentally altered him. The film changed his audiences, but it also, irrevocably, changed him. Fast forward to the comeback. And yes, there was a comeback. Apocalypto in 2006. Hacksaw Ridge in 2016, which earned him his second Academy Award nomination for Best Director and won 2 Oscars. The critical establishment, begrudgingly, could not deny the work. Because here's the thing about Mel Gibson that his enemies have never been able to erase. The man can direct, not just competently, at a level that puts him in rarefied company. And during this period, he started speaking again, openly, about The Passion, about what it cost him, about what he believes it meant. And what he revealed in these later interviews is, I would argue, even more striking than anything he said in the film's initial promotional cycle. Because now there was no box office to protect, no studio relationship to maintain, just a man looking back at the defining chapter of his life with clear eyes. What he revealed was this: he believes the film was spiritually opposed, not just politically opposed, not just commercially opposed. He believes, and he says this without embarrassment or qualification, that there were forces actively working against the film's completion that went beyond human hostility. He talks about an atmosphere on set that couldn't be explained by normal production stress, about the sense that something was fighting back against what they were trying to create. Now, you can hear that and decide what you want to decide. You can write it off as a magical thinking of a deeply religious man who had been through an extraordinary ordeal. Or you can look at the documented record, the lightning strikes, the injuries, the relentless external opposition, the financial brinkmanship, and at least acknowledge that the production of The Passion of the Christ was, by any measurable standard, something that should not have survived. And yet it did. It not only survived, it became one of the most watched, most discussed, most deeply felt films in the history of cinema. And there's one more thing. One final thing that Mel Gibson has confirmed, and that almost never gets the attention it deserves. The sequel. For years, rumors circulated about a follow-up to The Passion, a film about the resurrection. And Gibson has confirmed that this project is not just a rumor. It's real. It's in development. He has described it as potentially the most important film ever made, saying that if The Passion was about the greatest act of love in human history, the resurrection story is about the greatest act of triumph. He has been working on the script for years. The logistics are staggering. The spiritual weight of the undertaking, by his own admission, is even heavier than what he carried the first time. But he's doing it. Because if there's one thing the story of Mel Gibson and The Passion of the Christ has taught us, it's that when this man decides something matters, truly existentially matters, he does not stop. He gets struck by lightning, and he keeps the camera rolling.